Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. When I was younger, Hotel California was always one of my favorite songs in my dad's music collection. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, and the atmosphere it created was mesmerizing, so now that I'm a real music theorist, I thought it'd be fun to go back and take a look at what it was I was actually hearing. It starts like this. And I'm just gonna stop it there for a second. These are what's called arpeggios, where the notes of a chord are played one at a time instead of all at once, and they're all over this intro. That's not a problem though, all we have to do is squish them all together to get back our full chord, and once we do that, we have B minor and F#7, which are the 1 chord and the 5 chord in B minor. This immediately brings to mind the concept of functional harmony, which as we've mentioned elsewhere, is the idea that different chords in a key have different functions or jobs to do. The 1 chord has what's called tonic function, which means it provides a sense of rest, while the 5 chord has dominant function, which means it points back to the 1 chord. So far, we're off to a fairly simple start. But the F#7 doesn't resolve like we'd expect. Instead, we get this, which is where things start to get weird. Where before the chord qualities were fairly straightforward, here we've got some more exotic sounds. This A sus2 chord, for instance, is what happens when you take a normal A chord and replace the 3rd degree with a note a major second above the root. This creates some ambiguity because it's not clear whether it's supposed to be major or minor, and I think that's the point here. Based on the key, we'd expect to see A major, and using the sus2 chord instead removes some of the brightness that would have created. Likewise, this E9 chord has an added note called attention, which again adds more color to it. It's also worth noting that these alterations make the chords easier to play on a guitar, but as a theorist, I'm sure that's just a coincidence. Anyway, those changes aside, there's also something else going on here, a harmonic motif. This is when the same basic chord movement is repeated over and over, and we can see that by comparing the chords from the first part to the chords in the second. In both cases, you have a starting chord, followed by a dominant 7th whose root is a 4th lower. All we've done is shifted the pattern down by a whole step. That creates a problem though. The F#7 was pointing back to the 1 chord, which means it had dominant function, but the E9 is actually pointing to some sort of A chord instead. It's still directional, but instead of leading home, it wants to take us to a secondary location, so we just call it a secondary dominant. That doesn't resolve either though, instead feeding into this, which is another statement of our harmonic motif, again lowered a whole step. The precise shapes of the chords are slightly different, but the overall effect is the same, and finally we end with this, which is just the 4 and 5 chords. The 4 chord has subdominant function, which means its job is to create instability and set up that 5 chord, which then finally resolves back to the start of the phrase. But there's something bigger going on here that gets lost when we take things in little chunks like this. Let's zoom out a bit and look at the whole progression. Now let's remove the unresolved dominants. You know what, let's drop this E minor 7 too to get a nice even number of chords, and while we're at it, we'll clean this up to A major, which leaves us with one of my favorite chord progressions, often called the Andalusian cadence, which is basically just a walk down the minor scale from the 1 chord to the 5. It's a popular technique in flamenco and other guitar-heavy genres, and this whole intro seems to be just an intensely decorated version of it. That progression continues through the verse, which means our next stop is the chorus. First, I want to talk about the transitions. The verse ends with F#7, which we said is supposed to go to B minor, but the chorus starts with G major instead. This is what's called the Deceptive Resolution, and it works because G major is almost identical to B minor. There's only 1 note difference, so even though it's not where we expect to go, it's still a pretty solid resolution. But moving on to the chorus itself, we have a bit of a problem. We could keep analyzing it in B minor, but if we do that, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Instead, I'd probably analyze this section in the key of D major. This is called a relative modulation, and it's incredibly subtle because we don't actually change any of the notes, we just change how we use them in order to create a different sense of tonality. It's a small difference, but it leads to a completely new harmonic landscape. Anyway, we start here with a 4 chord followed by the 1. The 4 chord is unstable but not very directional, so moving from it back to the 1 gives us a weaker resolution than we get from, say, the 5. This is often called a plagal cadence, and it helps us avoid creating too much of a sense of finality. Then we go to F#7 followed by B minor. This looks a lot like that 5-1 movement we saw earlier, but remember, we're not in B anymore, so the F#7 has become a secondary dominant, pointing us to the 6 chord. Then the song does something that honestly confused me for quite a while. It resolves that 6 minor back to the 4 chord, which isn't really how that works. If you play the chords by themselves, there's no real resolution, but if you listen to the section, It's pretty clearly there, and that clip may have given you a clue as to why. It's all in the walk-up. The rising line, the accelerating rhythm, and the big, powerful electric guitar all combine to create a sense of tension and release that, from a harmonic perspective, really shouldn't exist. And I don't know about you, but I find that fascinating. Anyway, that feeds into this. Which has that same plagal cadence as before. Then we set up our return to the verse key with the same 4 and 5 chords we saw at the end of that progression. You may be wondering about the F-sharp augmented, but that's mainly just a bit of extra decoration. This song is full of things like that. The Eagles were all fairly accomplished session players before starting their own band, and they're really good at adding little flourishes throughout the song that help keep things fresh. They go back and forth between these two sections for a while, then finally we get to a solo over the verse progression. In fact, not just a solo, but a conversation. This section is a guitar battle between Don Felder and Joe Walsh, each one masterfully playing off the other. I'm not going to go through the whole thing because there's a lot, but I do want to talk a bit about the end, or rather the lack of an end. Like we saw in the Comfortably Numb video, it doesn't actually finish. In fact, it's still building momentum when they fade the track out, giving the sense that it goes on forever, which is stunningly appropriate for this song. After all, the last line we hear is, "You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave." Anyway, that's basically it, but before we go, I wanted to let you know that next Friday, June 8th, Adam Neely's going to be hosting the inaugural YouTube Music Theory livestream featuring me, Sideways, and 8-Bit Music Theory. We're going to be hanging out, talking about music, and taking audience questions, and you may even see my face. It's at 4 p.m. Eastern Time over on Adam's channel, so set an alarm or whatever, and I'll see you there. Or I won't, but you'll see me, and I'll read the things you're typing, and you know what? I don't have to explain live streams to you. Bye! Okay, seriously, thanks for watching, and thanks to Patreon patron Matt Osborne for suggesting this song. If you'd like to see your favorite song analyzed, just head on over to Patreon and pledge at any level. You can also join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.